Hola, bienvenidos al húmedo podcast de Voice.
あなたはここに楽しんでいる。
نحن نحبكم ونريد سعادتكم.
你会有很多希望和喜悦。
Hello, everyone. My name is Josh, and you're listening to the Moist Boys podcast, what will officially be the first episode of the podcast. I am joined this episode with one of the other Moist Boys, Jonathan.
Hello.
So on this episode, we're going to be talking about some story games that we've played. These are what are sometimes referred to, not in a kind way, usually as walking simulators or things of that nature, where a certain type of person doesn't appreciate that they're called video games. Essentially, if you go into the review section and you see people complaining that these aren't really games, these are probably the ones that they're talking about.
That seems fair.
So what?
Well, I guess.
Oh, I was just gonna ask, what are your thoughts on like story games in general, and I guess playing them?
It depends. So with me, I can't do anything that's first person, just because I get like super crazy motion sickness from it.
Yeah.
So if there's a game that is just like, I guess a air quotes walking simulator, as long as whatever's happening is compelling, then I don't care if it's just walking around. If you can interject some sort of like gameplay and adventure into that walking around, then by all means go for it. Like the classic Pokemon, like you just walk around from town to town, but there's so much that you do in little bursts here and there that like it still is entertaining.
Yeah, because you have in the original Pokemon, there's that haunted tower that I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. What is it?
It's the
is it?
It's in Lavender Town. Is it just Lavender Tower?
It might just be the Lavender Tower. That sounds about right. But I'm sure if anybody listens to this, they can complain about it and look it up, or if they'll already know it. But I always felt like, going through that tower and reading all the creepy inscriptions and talking to the people, and then it's kind of interrupted by these kind of obnoxious ghost encounters that you have to get away from. So I feel like, that's an example of, if you just got those story things and you had like a creepy atmosphere and kind of creepy music, and you had these little stories that you're reading, that would make a compelling game that I would probably enjoy playing at some point.
Yeah. If you're talking about taking out the battle aspect of it, or the randomized battle aspect, I should say.
Yeah. So along those lines, I've got a list here of games that I'm going to be talking about that I've played on my end of the conversation. And I think a good place to start along those kind of same lines is a game called Everybody's Gone to the Rapture by a publisher called The Chinese Room. They are a British group. They also did Dear Esther, which I will play eventually, but I have not played it yet. And you'll see the same complaints for both of these games, where people say all you do is walk around and listen to the story and there's no gameplay. But for me, I think for something to be, as long as it's compelling, like you were saying it, then as long as the writing, and in this case voiceover work and story, are interesting, then I'm going to go along with it, and just to, because I want to find out what's going on. So I think that the two big things would be the voiceover work and writing, which are very important typically in a story game, because that's kind of the main draw, because there isn't that interactivity where you're kind of controlling the world. I think everybody who's gone to the Rapture has it's very good writing, and I was always compelled to kind of go on and to solve the mystery of what happened. So it's about this small British village. You kind of wake up outside of this observatory, and you walk down the road into a village, and it's empty, but it seems like everyone's kind of just been whisked away. Out of nowhere, you'll find abandoned cars with the radio still on, and there's a bunch of TVs playing cryptic messages. So right away, you kind of get this eerie vibe and eerie atmosphere that propels you forward. And as you go through, you find these gold orbs that you have to activate. And every time you do, there's a little scene will play between a couple of characters, and slowly you kind of find out what happened to the people in this town. And I think my two big takeaways from it were the dynamic kind of daytime setting. So as you walk through the town and you go from one end of the village to another, the kind of like it goes from kind of early morning and then through midday, and finally you get to the night as you get to the end of the story, and you kind of find out what happened, and it all wraps up. The other important thing too for story games, and I think a lot of these ones that I'm going to talk about kind of have the same theme, is that music plays a important part. And for me, music can excuse a lot of bad or not necessarily bad, but can excuse a lot of things in video games and even in movies. I don't know if that's the same for you, or like music will kind of make you overlook other aspects you might not like so much.
I think it depends on how good the music has to be. Pretty good. There are definitely a few things where I will go and I will try to find a soundtrack to something after I've played the game, which a game that we'll be talking about later on. I'll dive back into that a little bit later. But a soundtrack is a huge part of it for me too. If whatever is, I am like, if the gameplay is super sparse in the sense of just walk around, hit a button to interact with something, the choices or lack of choices of music can really help to keep you involved and keep you wanting to continue on if there's a good amount of tension in the music, or if at the right parts it's relaxing enough, and it can maybe lull you into a false sense of security. I can definitely let things like that kind of take me a little bit more if the soundtrack is really good.
Yeah, definitely. So for Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, it was definitely one of those soundtracks where after I was done playing it, I was like wanting to listen to it just to kind of get the same feeling of when I was playing it. So the soundtrack was by a woman named Jessica Curry. She's an opera singer and composer that's working out of England. And I would definitely suggest going on to, even if you don't play the game, if you're looking it up, I know that most of the tracks were on YouTube at one point. You can actually purchase the soundtrack. And that might be something that I might even do later on, just because like the soundtrack is so evocative, and it's tied so directly into the atmosphere of the game itself.
I just found the soundtrack on iTunes, and I'm gonna go download it right now.
Let me see. So I don't want to spoil the stories of these games too much, just because I think with a story game, it's important to have this story, particularly ones. And I think for me, all of these ones fall under the list of ones that I think are worth playing and experiencing as a story. And I think the other thing that it's important for story games too is to kind of, it doesn't have to necessarily answer questions, but just kind of asking questions and kind of making you kind of wonder about how you feel about things as well. Because the theme of the game, or one of the themes of the game, and it's kind of becomes apparent early on, is kind of isolation and loneliness, which you can feel immediately when you're kind of put into this situation, and you're in first person, so you don't even see your own body, and you kind of, there isn't anybody to see, and as you're going through it, the only figures you're seeing are these kind of golden, ghostly shapes that are kind of recreating things that happened. So that's what I've got for Everybody's Gone to the Rapture. What's your first game on the list?
Also, as a side note, real quick, I was just looking through this. She's also the person who did the soundtrack for Better. So if that's an incentive to get you to play that game a little bit more.
I think you broke up a little bit there for a second. What was the game that you said?
Oh, she did the soundtrack for Dear Esther.
Oh, okay, yeah. I think she was married or is married to the game director, so they know each other that way.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. That's cool. So I guess the first game that I would want to talk about that doesn't necessarily have as positive of a experience on my end was the game. Oh crap! I messed up the name on here. Is it 3/4 Home? Is that what it's called?
Oh yeah, 3/4 Home.
Yeah. Okay. So that game, that to me is a good example of how not necessarily to do the in this case driving simulator properly, in that not any like spoilers or anything, but like you literally have to hold down the button to drive, and then you're just expected to read all of the dialogue on the screen. So while there are changes happening to the scenery, you don't necessarily get to enjoy them or see them because you're reading the entire time.
Yeah, for my experience, I do think that the having to hold down the trigger is kind of a detriment to the game. It kind of like, well, after a while, because you can play the whole thing in like one sitting. So when I was playing it, about 15-20 minutes into the game, like my finger was starting to hurt, get sore a little bit just from having to hold down the trigger the whole time. What I will say, kind of to defend the reading part, is kind of the way that it works your eye line a little bit, and kind of the especially, and this is kind of a little bit of a spoiler, but it's only really a 20-minute game, and there's kind of different things that the story works in. But there is a part where you're reading the story from your brother is reading his story to you. So as you're driving along, you're reading the text on the screen, and there were a few times that I thought I saw something in the sky above the car, and then I was like, oh no, I mustn't have seen that. And then as the story went along, I realized that I kind of was seeing what I thought it was, and I thought that was kind of cool. And then there's also a couple other times when like the character would say, I'm driving past the old silo, and you would read that, and then there would be no dialogue, and you would look up and you see the old silo go by, or like the school or something. So I think as a kind of experimenting with with a visual novel, I think it was kind of interesting, but I think it definitely would have improved if they had. I think it was just made by even just one guy, and a couple of testers or QA testers. But I do think it would have worked a little bit better maybe if there had been different, like if you had to alternate different buttons, because holding down that trigger, your finger kind of gets sore after a few minutes.
Yeah, a little bit. And then while I was playing through the epilogue as well, it felt like it was trying to go into a almost otherworldly direction, or it was trying to make you think it was going to.
Yeah.
And then it would do it for about a second, and then the conversation would shift, and then it would just go back to normal. And then I would say something, and it would do that again, where like the world almost kind of like peels away around you. I was like, oh, okay, are we getting into like what is actually going on right now? Because I don't know if it was just the way that I ended the game, but the ending of the game itself is very vague. And so I was expecting the epilogue to kind of like tie up what had happened, but it seems like it's a completely detached thing. It's not even a continuation of what was going on. And so just like walking back and forth at a bus stop and having these conversations where the world is changing around you for a brief second, and then there was no way to exacerbate that happening. Every time it would happen, you or the person you're on the phone with would say something, and then it would calm down and just go back to normal. I couldn't tell what they were trying to get me as the person playing it to feel, like what I was supposed to be trying to do in this conversation. And so every time I got the opportunity to, I would go that route of just being like real angry or snarky to get that world to peel again and see if that opened anything, and it never did. And then I finished it and was like, oh, I feel like I should play through that again and just try to be a decent human being to the person on the other end of the phone.
Yeah, I definitely think the first part, I think, was stronger on its own, as far as like even like as you're getting to the end of the game, the lighting and then the kind of tornado alarm that goes off kind of adds a lot of tension, and I think it ends on a very good note. And I think because the way that the first part ends and then you get to the second part, it kind of ends in the same way, where you're still not sure what's supposed to be going on in the story. So I think that adding that second part that doesn't really add anything was definitely a weakness. I will say though that I went through and looked at there's like special features where you can go through and look at like photographs and read the brothers' short stories. Some of those were pretty interesting, and I did like some of the stories that they had put in there. So I think that was good. I think if they had just removed that epilogue, it would have been a lot stronger of an experience and kind of ended with a heavier punch than they ended up with.
Yeah, I did like going through and exploring the photography. Just as somebody who enjoys kind of that sort of style of photography and would like to do it if I had the equipment to do it, but God knows it's hard enough to afford that kind of stuff. And so I did enjoy getting to look through that. I didn't really go through and do any of the reading, and I listened to a couple of tracks on the soundtrack, which were actually like the soundtrack to that one is, I thought at least, it was a really decent soundtrack. Not enough to save the experience for me, but what music was playing when it would let it happen, I did enjoy.
It was kind of like synthwave, but played on just guitars, which is kind of like a weird way to explain it. But that's like kind of what it made me thought of, where it was kind of like the aesthetic of synthwave, but they were just playing it on guitars instead of.
Yeah.
Which I thought some of those were pretty good in it, especially in that first part where you're driving in the car. I think a lot of the music worked pretty well in that. Did you have any other thoughts about 3/4 Home? I think we.
I don't think we pretty well covered everything that I really wanted to say about that one. I guess to sum up, good attempt. I would be interested to see something from that creator again, but maybe with a slightly bigger team and voice acting. I would like to see some voice acting.
Yeah, I think because I think in the first half, the reading kind of, for me, it helped with like the changing of the eye lines between like the two halves of the bottom and top half of the screen. But I do think in the second half, having voiceover might have helped a little bit because you're able to kind of play up where you're trying to go through or go where you're say in that second half. I will say though that I did get it for only $350 on the Xbox store, so I think for that, as far as an experience goes, it was a good value that way.
Yeah, that's fair.
So the next game on my list is one that is kind of polarizing. Either you think it's the dumbest game that's ever been made and it was completely pointless, or if you're like me, you kind of enjoyed the experience and the ending kind of made you a little nostalgic or melancholy. And it's a game called Firewatch. I played it on the PlayStation a while back, and so the two. Well, this hits 3 of like my big 4 things for a story game. So kind of to go over those again. For me, it would be voiceover work, the writing, atmosphere, and music are kind of like the 4 things that I look for. This one had music, but it didn't play as big a role in my kind of how I felt about it. But it definitely had the other 3. The voiceover work was very good. I didn't look up who the voiceover actors were, but they did a very good job. They were very compelling and sold the situation. I feel like the writing was strong. It is a mystery, and there is a mystery to solve, but it's not necessarily the one that you expect it at the beginning, which is, I think, and I'll probably go into depth on this point a little bit more later, but I feel like part of the thing that people have against story games is that a lot of the time there isn't a lot of, like, the choices you make don't necessarily affect the outcome of the game. And I think this is one of those things where people wanted a certain ending, and when they didn't get it, they were kind of disappointed. And then the atmosphere was between the setting and the lighting and sound effects. I think it had a very strong atmosphere. So in the beginning of the game, it actually starts off with a prologue before you even start the game proper, where it's just some text on a screen where you're reading about the character that you're going to end up playing. And he kind of meets this woman, and they start going out, and then they get a dog, and then she ends up getting cancer, and then she's sick. And to kind of get away from his responsibilities on that end, he takes a job at a Firewatch in, I want to say, I can't remember what state they're in, but it's essentially it's a real thing that I've actually seen kind of pictures of, where there are these Firewatch towers where you're kind of sitting up like 100 feet in the air, and you just kind of sit around and make sure that there aren't any fires that are going to be starting, or if there are fires, you call it in and make sure they don't get out of control. So at the beginning of the game, you're kind of going around doing various tasks and making sure everything's as it should be, and then you run into these two campers that are like making a mess, and they're littering everywhere and making a big scene, and he calls out to them and to try to scare them away. And then later on, as he's kind of going through his rounds, he finds their campsite, and it's been all torn up, and there's no sign of the campers anywhere. So you're thinking something must have happened to them. And kind of as you go through the game, there's a mystery begins unfolding where you see mysterious figures that are standing outside at night, and you see these weird lights, and there's maybe a weird science station involved. But again, like the story doesn't go where you think it's going to go. And for me, I thought it was very compelling as far as the way that it looks at how people kind of deal with stress. So like how this guy has dealt with the stress of his wife that he left at home, who's sick, and kind of escaping into this fantasy world where, you know, he's not sure what's what. It is in first person, so there's that. But I think if first person doesn't bother you, if you're listening out there, then I would say that this is definitely a good one to check out.
A couple of trivia notes here. I just started looking up on the IMDb. So it is the Fire Watchtower itself is in the Wyoming wilderness.
There you go.
And it looks like there is currently a film adaptation in the works.
I think that could be an interesting. It would depend on the take that they go with it. I think much more than say a highly interactive game where you're kind of controlling what's happening, and like if your enjoyment of the game is your interaction with the world, then I think turning it into a movie is a lot more difficult. Like with say like a movie that just came out this year that was a pretty close adaptation is the most recent Tomb Raider movie. And I think the main problem with that is that a lot of the set pieces that happen in the movie are compelling in the game because you have some amount of control. So as you're going through, you know, you're having to stay vigilant at all times to, like, say, dodge out of the way of a branch or whatever. So like the tension that you're feeling as you're watching for stuff to pop up on screen kind of disappears when you don't have any control over it. Whereas in a story game where you're kind of taking the game along to unfold the story, I think it'd be a lot easier to be able to translate that over to a medium where you're also not necessarily directing or in charge of directing where the game is going.
Yeah, but it's more of you. If you're already along for the ride and the game aspect of it, that will translate to you being along for the ride.
Yeah. So what's your next game?
The next one that I have, I think, is actually the last one that I can think of. Actually, is a game called Oxenfree, which I think you played as well, right?
Yeah, and actually that detail will come up later on as we discuss it.
Okay, so I am a big fan of choose your own adventure dialogue stuff, which is what I was actually really looking forward to with 3/4 Home, where it was you got to choose what you say and it propelled the conversation. But this is done substantially better, in my opinion, in completely different gameplay, of course. So I can't really, it's apples to oranges. But the group being put onto the island, and then all of the voice actors in this game are 100% fantastic. And going to the four things that you're looking for in story, voice acting, music, and then atmosphere. This one hits all four for me. It's definitely one of the favorite games that I've played in the last year, and I have been playing it for a year to get as many of the alternate versions of the game that I can, because I don't want to go into too many spoilers or anything like that. But there are alternate ways to end the game. And whereas 3/4 Home made me constantly think it was going to go into a supernatural sort of thing, this one actually does it, and it does it really well. And your actions do have consequences. And I think that's something that I definitely look for in a story game like this. I do like just being along for the ride, but I also really like being in control and feeling like what I'm doing has weight. This is just one of the best games that I've played in this last year, and I could go on forever talking about it, but it's 10 out of 10 for me. This is the game that I went and downloaded the soundtrack, and it is such a good. It's the perfect like haunted house soundtrack.
Yeah,
but without being like cliche and having like the creaking doors open and stuff like that. But it's just got a real good feel of parts of it where you just feel really at ease, parts where you just feel really like the hair standing up on the back of your neck because you don't know what's going to happen next. And even though the game itself is a relatively slow pace, it does a really good job of getting you terrified of what's coming around, not like coming around the corner, basically. They don't do the like usual kind of jump scare stuff, but there is some things where the world around you kind of just shifts for a second, and it keeps you on your toes a little bit more than some games will. But you're never racing for buttons, and I like that because I like being able to take in what's happening and then react to it, and it gives you a really good amount of time to do that, I feel.
Yeah, the only time where you're kind of rushed, and I think they did this in hindsight, I think when I was looking back on it, I was like, oh, it was probably on purpose. But at the time, it was a little frustrating. But then like, as I was thinking about it, I was like, oh, it's kind of how like the conversations work, where there would be a conversation going on, and then your conversation option tree would open up. But then as the conversation is going, usually when that happens, you wait till all the dialogue's been said, and then you think, oh, what am I going to say now? But in this one, like the dialogue starts like the timer's going down halfway through their conversation. So you're like, instead of listening to what they're saying, you're kind of thinking about what you're going to be saying next, which I think it was a thing that they did probably on purpose to kind of like point out that like, that this character is thinking and what kind of like mindset, and even just like people in general, when they're having a conversation, they're not really listening to what's being said. They're kind of like waiting for their turn to jump into the conversation. And so it's like when you're saying like sometimes your hair will stand on end, where there's definitely a few times where I got some like serious chills where there would just be like a flash of something that you see. So one of the times that it happened is that there are several times when you'll have like walk past a reflective surface, like a mirror or a body of water or something, where you'll see your character's reflection, but there'll be like another character's name over top there. Is like the first few times that it happened, it was just like random like letters and numbers, so I didn't know what it was. But then there were a couple times when I actually saw your Xbox Live handle up above the person's name, and like while I was trying to figure out like, wait, what's going on? Why is he in my game? Like lines of dialogue were spoken, And then like by the end of the game, like when I realized what was happening, I was like, oh wow, that's actually like a really cool thing that they're able to work into the game. And I think it's like the only time that I've ever seen like having an always online thing actually work out very well. And then like there were also a few times where there's you're kind of put into a situation where you have to pick like the right pieces of dialogue to actually like save characters, and like just the atmosphere that they were able to build around those, like between the sound effects and the music and like the urgency of the dialogue, where you just have like this knot in your stomach where you're like, you don't want to make the wrong decision.
Yeah, I really liked once I figured out that the things that were happening in the mirror were somebody else.
Like,
and somebody else in the sense of like somebody else who played it.
Yeah.
Somebody else who played it said those things. And then, at the end of the game, when you get to choose those things for somebody else, I really like that. That's a really cool thing.
And that's where kind of like the ticking clock comes back again, because like it's the only time that they're rushing you through the game and like they're pushing you to like make the right decision. You're trying to think back of like, what am I supposed to be saying at this right time, so that later on, because what you say to the characters can actually have a very important effect on what happens later in the game, and the choices you make, even though it's not until like the second or third time that you're playing through and you're hearing these pieces of dialogue that you even understand like how it's going to come into play later.
Yeah. How many times did you play through it?
So for me, I really find it hard, and this is for a lot of things. I would say probably the only two exceptions would be like music, obviously, because there's a lot of replayability, and some movies that I'll watch over and over again. But for me, I really find it hard to replay games, and also with like books and like a lot of other stuff where I find it really hard to replay through it. And so I haven't actually gone back yet. And also part of it is because like, just like the like lightning in a bottle of playing the game for the first time, I'm kind of worried that it'll diminish a little bit, even though I think that like the things that they do well, like the voice acting and the music and the atmosphere and all that, were strong enough to for multiple playthroughs. I'm worried that like it'll diminish a little bit, and then also just like the stress of having to make the different decisions over again. It's because by the end of it, you kind of like sit back and you're just completely emotionally exhausted by having to go through all these different choices. Especially because I think I played it in like 2 playthroughs, each one for like 5 hours or 4 or 5 hours. So yeah, I kind of like, there was so much like exhaustion and all that. So I do find it hard to play games a second time, but I might, unless they're like an arcadey one, but I might go back and play this one again.
I would highly recommend giving it a second run through, because again, not trying to spoil anything, but the second time you go through is actually a continuation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and so there are a lot of things that are different.
Well, that's actually pretty interesting. The other thing that I like that it did too is that even when you get to a point where there are supernatural things happening, like the levels at which they're happening it's gradual and you're slowly brought into it. And then also there's a lot of like little clues, and this is definitely a game that rewards you for finding the story parts, not just, collecting 100 like bird feathers like in Assassin's Creed, but like actually going through and finding like the story. There's a lot of story beats that are hidden throughout that actually add a significant amount of information that aren't just like, well, if you find it, it's fine, but if you don't, then you're not going to miss anything. Like, if you don't find a lot of these things, like, you're going to miss out a lot.
Yeah, and a lot of it is if you don't find a lot of I can't remember the character's name, the person who owned the island left letters scattered everywhere.
Yeah.
And if you don't find a certain number of them, you don't get the correct ending of the game.
Yeah. So I don't know if you did this or not, but one of the things I like to do would be going to different parts of the island and then just going through on the radio that you get and then just listening to all the really weird, like they had, I think my favorite part of the game was just the production they did on the radio broadcast they had on there, because there's like there has a huge amount of like atmosphere to the game. So I would just like go to a spot and then just run through the dials and find all the different weird parts, because that's one of the other parts where you could find story information too, is if you're standing in a certain spot and you turn to a certain station, there's going to be backstory to the game and kind of like inklings, even though you don't know it at the time, of what's going to happen, of what the story ultimately is. And I thought that was really interesting. Any old timey radio stuff, I'm gonna like be drawn to it, just because I feel like the aesthetic of the 1920s through 40s radio stuff is very interesting to me.
Yeah, the world building is really well done.
So one question I have for you is, did you gravitate more towards, which I can't remember what the kid's name is, because there's her stepbrother, and then there's her best friend that she was hanging around with. Which one did you gravitate more towards?
I think initially, I'm trying to remember my first playthrough. So there's the main character, Alex.
Yeah, that's right.
His stepbrother is Jonas, and then the best friend is Ren. And I want to say that because in my first playthrough, because I liked the performance that the voice actor for Ren was giving so much, that I just wanted to make him happy.
Yeah.
And there were definitely a couple times where I did accidentally say the wrong thing and definitely went in the other direction of that, and then felt really bad afterwards.
Yeah.
So I think by the end of it, I kind of just landed in the middle and didn't have a strong connection with either one by the end of my first playthrough.
Yeah, when I played through it, I ended up going with Jonas, just because, and this is a thing that I kind of have with games, and kind of stories in general, whereas if I get that kind of from Ren, I got a little bit of the I guess, for lack of a better word, I kind of got like that incel vibe off of him. So I was just like, oh, dude, no, I gotta stay away from that. I don't even want to mess with that. Which isn't to say like he did a bad job, but just the character, the type of character that he is, I was just instantly like, no, I don't want to mess around with that. So I did end up going with Jonas the whole time, which I think for me ended up helping, because having only played through it once, I'm gonna have to go on assumption here, but I assume that the person you're with ends up not being what you're going to have to kind of like when you're trying to save people throughout certain parts of the game. I assume that affects that a little bit. So I think having like that motivation worked for me, where like the reason why you have to save them and also kind of being distant ended up working, and his performance ended up working very well.
I will say Ren seems like the kind of kid who would wear a fedora and say "milady."
I don't think he said it in the game, but I think there were a couple times where I was like, oh, he's gonna say it. But yeah, like I would definitely say, like particularly because when I played it, it was I think when we both played it, it was one of the free games with the gold membership on the Xbox store, and it was definitely the best free game that they've given out since I've been on there. I would say even games in general, I would say, yeah, it's definitely, if not a 10, then at least a 9 out of 10, because I think everything that it aesthetically, performance wise, everything that it set out to do, I was definitely along for the ride, even to the point where, like, if I knew that there was going to be a decision coming up, I would be like completely dreading having to make that decision, and just like knowing that I would be like destroying another path that I wouldn't be able to go down, and just like having that responsibility was like, it's really, and not to say that in a bad way, but like just how much the game is able to sell you on the world that it's putting out there. And I would say that there's a point in the first part where you're going along, and I think it's like the first of the end of the first chapter, where you do that first Polaroid, and like that moment is when I just like my entire body just like went cold, and I was like, this is not the game that I thought it was going to be.
Yeah. Also, if I can do a quick shots fired real quick. So when we got that game, that they gave us that game in October of 2017, and I feel like that was the last solid game they put out on there.
Yeah, it's definitely the last one that I hadn't played. I think since then they've put out Assassin's Creed, the one that takes place in England.
It was Trinity, wasn't it? No, Unity. My bad.
No, it was the one after that. No, not Syndicate.
Yeah, Syndicate.
Yeah, which I think was probably my favorite Assassin's Creed game. Very closely behind, or with a Black Flag right in front of that. But yeah, like other than that, it's just kind of been. I feel like half of them are free to play games where you just get a couple extra skins, but it's been a lot of trash on there, a lot of isometric shooters.
A lot of it just feels like this should just be a mobile game, but it's on my TV.
Yeah.
Not to disparage mobile games at all, because I play mobile games a lot, way more than I probably should, and they're fun as hell, and I'm not even mad about it.
But they're definitely a thing where it's like it's a thing that you're doing on your phone when you're ignoring something else, not when you're like sit at home, you're gonna sit down and actually like put yourself into a game.
Yeah.
So any other quick thoughts about that one? I think we hit that one pretty well.
Yeah, no, I think that's all I got for that one.
So I would say if you're listening to this and you haven't played it yet, I would say it's 100%. Definitely go and play that one. As long as you don't, like, I would say, and now probably for most of these, you know, if you're a Gamergator, then you probably want to stay away. But like, if you're tired of the Call of Duties and all those other ones, I think that would be definitely 100% recommend to. I would buy it personally, and to either to play it again and again, or just to know that it's there and be able to remember that experience that you had.
Yeah, I think to buy it is like $20, and that is 100% worth it to me.
Yeah, if I had known the experience I was going to have, I wouldn't have any problem with that. I would say that the other thing too that's important with these, and that's kind of why we want to be vague, is that knowing anything can spoil a lot. So like knowing, like even as much as we've said on here, I think might be like too much as far as how much I would want to know personally going into these games. Like when I played Oxenfree, I literally knew nothing about it. Like it was free, so I downloaded it, I started it up, and like everything was a surprise. And I think for a lot of these, like that surprise is a important part.
Yeah, definitely, especially in something like in that game where you don't want to, like, I don't want to say what any of my choices have been, because you are supposed to choose it yourself, and that is part of the journey.
Yeah, I mean, and there are well, I was just gonna say there are like 6 or 7 different possible endings, and like even like with like 4 or 5 different permutations within that, from what I've been able to gather. So like definitely there's a lot of choices that make a difference, and you don't even know at the time if it's necessarily going to be that decision or not that's going to be the one that makes that difference. All right, so there are a couple here that I just want to go through real quick. There is a choose your own adventure game that has a lot of different endings to it. It's a horror choose your own adventure game called Until Dawn, starring Rami Malek and the guy from Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., whose name I just went out of my head entirely.
Agent Ward.
Yeah, the guy who plays Agent Ward on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is in that game. It's I thought it was a lot of fun. There were some creepy moments to it. There are good collectibles that actually enhance the story a little bit. I did not find them all myself, but I did end up looking it up on YouTube after I finished the game, because I wanted to see how it ended up, how the collectibles kind of work themselves out, because they unlock different video clips. So I wanted to see the whole video, and but yeah, it was a lot of fun. There are a couple of twists that I didn't see coming. I almost got the best ending, but I failed towards the end, and I ended up not getting the best ending. But
if you're willing to share slight spoilers on that one, who'd you kill?
I can't. It was the brown-haired girl with the hat, I want to say.
Oh, okay. In the like the mine shaft.
Yeah, because for the most part, the decisions are pretty clear, like which ones are safe and which ones aren't. But there is one choice where they switched it up on me, where you think something is going to happen, but the opposite ends up happening. So when I made that choice, I was like, because there's like 2 spooky sounds, and I was like, well, I think this one's the safe route, but I ended up making the wrong choice. But yeah, otherwise it's pretty clear. Like the options are like run towards the monster or run toward freedom. And it's like, well, I'm gonna run toward freedom, unless
I'm gonna run towards freedom.
Yeah, there are a couple of times when they kind of like switch it up on you, where they're like run towards the monster, but there's like an axe that you're gonna grab and hit it over the head, or try to run away and leave your friends behind and sacrifice them. And it's like, well, obviously I'm not going to sacrifice, because that's like that's like one of those moral things where they're going to punish you for kind of being a coward. Yeah. So I was able to get everyone else but that one, because there's that one option where it just like seemed like I thought I was picking the obviously safer one, but no, I did not.
That one's only on PlayStation, isn't it?
I believe so, yeah. Because
okay, that's why.
Yeah, PlayStation again getting all the good exclusives, except I did see that the Senua Chronicles, I think it's called, is finally on Xbox. So I'm not sure. I do want to play that eventually, because I've heard good things about it.
Okay.
But for the most part,
yeah, I haven't gotten to play through, obviously, because I only have the Xbox. But I've watched a lot of playthroughs of Until Dawn. One of my favorites that I watched was specifically, I do not remember what the YouTube channel was, but it was a a Scottish guy, and he was specifically going through to pick the worst options, and it is hilarious.
Also, Peter Stormare, I completely forgot about until just now. He's really good at that. Like, he's really creepy, and like you're not sure what's going on with him through most of the game, and then when you realize, you kind of even don't know what's going on with that at the end too. You just kind of have to piece it together yourself. But I still liked the performance that he gave. I think pretty much everybody in that game. Hayden Panettiere, she's in it too.
I was gonna say, I was just looking up the cast here. Brett Dalton is the name we could not remember.
Yeah, that's the one. I think everybody in that gave good performances. For me, in a game, or pretty much in anything, if there's a character that starts off one way and you're feeling another way, and then by the end it's kind of turned around, I think that's a good performance, because there are a couple of characters at the beginning you kind of like, oh, I don't really like this character, but then by the time the chips are down and you have to make your decision, you kind of like, you still want to get that good decision and kind of get them through it safely. So
yeah. Also, I would say that game is like, I know there are games out there right now that are kind of doing this more and more, but that game gets the actors' likenesses so right.
Yeah,
it's crazy to look at.
Yeah, you can recognize them, like, because I don't think there's no credits before you see them. So like as they were popping up, I was like, hey, that's them and that's them. Whereas like before, it would be like just a cardboard box with someone's face painted on it, where these are actual like representations. All right, so that's I think that's a fun. That's more of like on the fun end, where like, you know, you're just kind of going through and picking wacky choices, and I think that would be a good game to kind of like do with a bunch of people and everyone's like yelling out what to do and yelling and screaming as they're going through.
Yeah, do a democracy run with like 5 people.
Yeah, which there are a couple of games on PlayStation that I've seen where they actually have that thing where kind of like with the Jackbox, where you have an app on your phone and you're playing along on that, which might be an interesting experiment to go through sometime. Let me see. So 2 games I kind of go through real quick, just because they're kind of older and there a lot has been said about them. So 2 games, both made by a notorious in gaming journalism circles creator called David Cage, I think. Gage. I can't remember. I think it's David Cage. Where these games get a lot of flack, but I think that they each had some strong parts to them. So the first one that I played by him was called Heavy Rain, which there are a couple of YouTube videos of people, maybe even the same person that you were talking about, they'll purposely play it bad to kind of get wacky looking things, which do look funny, but kind of like if you're playing through it, there can be some tense situations. And then the sequel to that one, which that game, it was okay. I think it was lacking a little bit in the performance area because they didn't really have real actors. They had voice actors, but I think you needed like actual performers because of how much the performance is going to be selling the game. But it did have a good atmosphere, and I think that the controls, I actually liked the way that they were integrated. But the one that I liked even more was the sequel to that, called Beyond Two Souls. And that had Ellen Page and Willem Dafoe, who both turn in pretty good performances, which I don't know how you feel about it, but I feel weird kind of saying that someone's performance is really good, even if it kind of is, just because like the way that we're kind of still think about video games as a medium.
I think that in those aspects, or these cases, I should say, where something like in the same way with Until Dawn, where it actually feels like it is a performance, because as opposed to just whatever happening on screen being because of the animators, you actually have motion capture going into it. Like I think was something that like a game LA Noire kind of tried to do, but I feel like they weren't quite up to snuff on the technology. But I think these later games took it, ran with it, and performed it better. So you actually do get really good performances from the actors doing it.
Yeah, I think LA Noire was just, like you were saying, it was just, I think it was ahead of its time, so it wasn't 100% there yet, because like a lot of the facial animations were okay for the time, were good for the time, but just the way things are now, it's like, and I think a lot of that has to be thanked to like Andy Serkis and all the people that he's worked with since like Lord of the Rings and King Kong and like all the stuff that he's worked with, people like advancing the art of motion capture, and also being able to not have to do the ping pong balls on the face to get their performance, but actually being able to get like 100 points of reference on the face to get the performance.
Yeah, I would if the company, I don't remember if it was, I thought for a while it was Rockstar, but it wasn't Rockstar that made LA Noire, was it? Because I had heard that the company that made LA Noire like ran into the ground.
Well, I think it was like Rockstar Paris or something like that. It was like one of their offshoots that they ended up closing down. There was supposed to be a sequel for a while, and I would like to see that, because I think there were a lot of good parts to that game. Also might be just because now what's the movie I'm trying to think of now? With Russell Crowe and Guy Pearce and LA Confidential.
Oh, LA Confidential. Yeah.
I feel like, that's one of my favorite crime movies of all time, and I think that there's enough kind of like aesthetically with the music and everything that I kind of get like a lot of the same feeling with that. So I think that some of that made some of my warm feelings toward that game. But I did end up liking it, and I think that some of the downfalls were a lot of the things that Rockstar I think still does slightly poorly, which is where the characters kind of feel like they're tanks on track sometimes.
That's why I would love to see somebody put the money into redoing that game with today's technology and really nail it.
Yeah, like even better than the remaster that they re-released, which I think is still kind of too close to the original to be a new experience. So kind of going back to what I was saying about the performances, Ellen Page and Willem Dafoe, I'm just going to say it, they were really good in this game, particularly Ellen Page, because she has to kind of go through like a 20-year span of this character and kind of sell all these different aspects of her life, whether she's like a young teenager kind of growing up and then transitioning to like a secret agent and into being homeless at one point, and really being able to sell all these different characters that she's having to play. I will say that even if the rest of it, like the performances and all that, weren't as good, I would still say that they did that thing that tricks me into liking games where they'll have a character sit down with a guitar and then just play either most of or an entire song. Which in Beyond Two Souls, she at one point she picks up a guitar and then plays Lost Cause by Beck, and like the performance that she does in that is probably like 90% of what I think that the performance the good performances. Even though she did a good job in the rest of the game, but like just that moment, I was like, oh, I'm sold on this game now. And the other example that I can think of off the top of my head is in Bioshock Infinite, when Booker DeWitt and Elizabeth, you're investigating like a tavern, I think, and you go out down into this basement, and there's a guitar just leaning up against a bench or whatever. And usually in games, like the most you can do is just like twang a couple of strings or just like punch a guitar into smithereens, and like other than that, they don't really serve a purpose. But on this one, like I walked up to the guitar and it said play guitar, so I was like, well, I guess I'm playing the guitar. And then I ended up sitting down, and then so the character sits down with the guitar and starts playing The Circle Will Remain Unbroken. And then as he's playing it, then him and Elizabeth start duetting, and I was like, well, like this is one of my favorite games now, which it still was, because just being able to punch like 20th century or 19th century racists in the face, just it's pretty gratifying just to stick a big giant claw into their faces.
That's always a good thing to put into a game.
Yeah,
always punch racists. Which
I think it's funny now, because I think that game came out in 2013 or 2012.
2012 or 2013, yeah, somewhere around there.
Yeah, I remember one of the complaints was like, oh, like the violence against the racists that was just way too overboard. But now it's like, no, it wasn't overboard enough. Like, I want more of that.
Right. Now I feel like there would be a rallying cry of like, there should have been more violence to the racists.
Well, it would probably be like more polarized, where you'd have, on the internet at least, even though I think in the real world it would be like 95 to 5%, but on the internet it would be like 50-50 split of, you know, oh, they're calling them Nazis, but they're not actually Nazis, and they're not actually racist, and that's why we're being more of a bunch of assholes. And on the other side, you have people be like, no, we need more of punching them in the face. And I would definitely be in the punching them in the face camp, because I was back then where I was like, no, these people are saying these things, and I want to really just jam this skyhook right into this guy's eye.
Yeah, this is definitely a guy who would point to the sign that says whites only in the bathroom and be like, scoot away, little N-word.
Yeah.
That guy needs to be punched in the face.
Plus, like, Bioshock Infinite, I think, has hands down the best music of any video game I think that I've ever played. Just like the old-timey versions of pop songs, and you can't really find it. I don't think you can download it. I think it was part of a special edition at one point, but I think most of the songs are on YouTube, and I would definitely look up. My favorite one is the a cappella barbershop quartet version of God Only Knows by the Beach Boys. That's a top-notch song. And that's actually,
I will say, full disclosure, going into that game, being somebody who didn't listen to the Beach Boys, I had no idea that was a Beach Boys song. I thought it was a song written for the game, and I was like, this is a cool song. And then like later that year, Heather and I were doing our annual watching of Love Actually, and that song appears in that movie, and I was like, oh shit, that's a Beach Boys song. I feel like an idiot now.
And that game actually introduced me to, I'm not gonna remember his name now, but I do remember his YouTube channel. It's Postmodern Jukebox. The music director, the guy that plays the piano for that, actually did a lot of the music and a lot of the arrangements of those songs for Bioshock Infinite. So if you like Postmodern Jukebox or Bioshock Infinite, those are two things that definitely go well together.
I didn't realize that guy worked on the game.
Yeah, he did at least a couple of he did the Al Jolson version of a song. I can't remember which one it is, but there's a lot of good songs on there. There's REM, some Cyndi Lauper. So that was a brief tangent. I feel like with at least the first Bioshock game and Bioshock Infinite, that those ones are story games where the the gameplay is almost superfluously stacked on top. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing for me, because I do enjoy story games a lot. So like having those two separate experiences, I was okay with it. But I do think, like, you can tell that Ken Levine, who wrote those, was definitely, the story was definitely important, maybe even more so than the gameplay itself.
Yeah, it seemed like that the most important aspect of the games from his perspective was getting from A to B.
Yeah.
And they didn't want there to be a C or a D. You were just going to go A to B, and this is how you were going to do it. And you were going to get that broken up with some gameplay elements here and there. But like the wandering through Columbia is just like one of my favorite parts of that game.
Yeah, and I think it also has like one of the best endings of any video game, or most stories in general of all time, where I was just like, just the ideas that they were exploring, I was just like, this is completely just blowing my mind right now, which usually doesn't happen with games. But like that's like the ending of that, which at this point it's a kind of an old game, but that's definitely one of my favorite endings of a game. All right, let's see here. So just a couple more quick ones. A game that I recently picked up to go through again, just to double check some of the things, is another game that was free that I think was I had played it before already, so it but I still ended up picking it up. Is a game called Gone Home, which is another first person exploration game, which it does those same things that are important as that I had mentioned before. It has a good atmosphere. Like, even playing through it a little bit last night to kind of reacclimate myself to all the different aspects of it. Like, even though I knew what was going to happen, still just like the atmosphere and the creepiness of the setting, it was like this, it was just giving me chills just because of the way the light and sound effects were working together. It creates a definite atmosphere that kind of unsettles you and kind of doesn't lead you to where you think that the story is going to go. Mainly I was checking to make sure that it did actually have voiceover, which I had remembered that it had, but I couldn't remember. I didn't know if I was remembering correctly, which I was. It did have voiceover work, and I think the voiceover work and the writing were very strong in this, and definitely propelled the game into like the upper tier story games, where, you know, because you have to care about the characters a lot of the times, and I think that they were able to bring that across really well with that. And then there's also music plays a big part in that too. And I think for a story game, the music, if it's important for the characters, it'll come across really well as making it important for the game and for you as the player as well. So definitely, if you do enjoy story games, and this one has some kind of, it's a little bit more of a point and click game, where you have to like find different items to unlock different doors to progress through the story. And it's another one where unlocking all of the diary entries and voiceover clips, it isn't superfluous to the experience. It kind of is the experience, and like finding every single detail to kind of give you the story of the family at the center of it. It definitely is important for that.
That was one that I had tried to play because I was like, it'll be a slow enough pace. The first person stuff won't like set me off with my motion sickness. And then it did. It still set me off.
Yeah.
And I I don't do well with like horror stuff.
Yeah.
And I do even less well with it in first person. Because in third person, if something jumps out at you, it jumps out at the character, and you can like, I can divert my eyes to just my character being jumped at. Whereas I feel personally attacked when something is coming directly at the screen. And I don't know if anything like that actually does happen in that game, but I felt like the more I played it, the more likely something was going to happen. And so before I think it's like when you're supposed to go, I don't remember if it's like, is it her brother's bedroom or like the attic or something like that? And you're supposed to go into one of those rooms, and like whatever room it was, it creeped me the fuck out, and I was like, I'm done. I can't play this game anymore.
Yeah, I think pretty much all the rooms in that are creepy. Where like what I would end up doing is like backing into the room. Like backing through the door into the room so I couldn't see anything, and then turning on the light, and then slowly turning around to make sure. Which, not to give too much of a spoiler, but like this is Gone Home ends up being at the beginning it's like 50% horror, but by the end it's like you find out there's like 0% horror, which I think it definitely like plays up the atmosphere, like I was saying earlier, where like, you know, they're able to sell you on this thing where you kind of, even though you know it's just gonna be a walking simulator, you're sold on the fact that there's some sort of danger in the house that could get you at any minute. Which I think is the same feeling that you end up getting from Everybody's Gone to the Rapture and Firewatch also, where like as you're going through it, you always have this like feeling in the back of your mind, or the, you know, working down your spine, that something could happen at any moment. And like, even if you know that it's not going to, you still get that feeling of like, something's going to happen to me. I'm just like preparing for it to happen. So I would say if you are okay with first person games and they don't affect you, I would definitely give this a recommendation. There are a certain type of people that did complain about what the game ended up being about, and kind of dismissed it as not important. But I think if you find all the diary entries and you spend your time like becoming attached to this family, I think it ends up working a lot more than it being like some sort of scary ghost house that something jumps out at you at the end. All right. So my last game on this list, there are 3 full games and a chapter that have been released in a series. The series is called Life is Strange, which in certain circles of the internet is kind of blown up into something big at this point. So I would say that of the 4 things that I'm looking for, this really only hits 2 of them, but I think that between the voiceover work and, again, like music selling me on a game, this series has definitely got that in spades. So just like a quick rundown of some of the artists that they've gotten to do soundtrack. You've got Jose Gonzalez, who contributes a song. The sequel to Life is Strange, which is actually a prequel, was called Before the Storm, and there was a band called Daughter that actually did most of the soundtrack, like all of the instrumental stuff, and contributed a bunch of songs. So if that's a band that you're interested in, they did music for that. There's also a band called Wolf Alice that contributed a song, and then really I was sold on the original Life is Strange as I was playing through it, and then an Alt J song called Something Good popped up, and I was like, well, I'm sold on this game. Like this is a game that I'm going to be interested in now, because yeah, it's like this. It's one of those things where like, if it just hits the right aesthetic, like little trigger in my brain, it's just like a switch gets flipped, and I'm kind of sold on it immediately. So like, pretty much from hearing that song, from then on, I was like sold on the series, and just like having these people like this type of music in a game. It's very rare that you get like that genre of music in something like video games. They're just trying to be like as wide, like have a wide appeal as possible. And then there was another game in the series called The Awesome Adventures of Captain Spirit. And there was actually a completely original Sufjan Stevens song that he wrote for it. So again, like just a complete, like I was completely sold on it just for that. I was like, Sufjan Stevens wrote a song for it, and I'm gonna have to play it. And then I will say, having finished it today, there are a couple times when the song starts playing, and it's like, if you're gonna lose it, if you're susceptible to like losing it, then yeah, there's a couple of times when the song starts playing, and I'm just like, well, I'm done for the day.
I didn't realize that that game was connected to the Life is Strange series.
So it's actually, yeah, it's a free game that they released, which you can pretty much finish it in like an hour and a half, which is fine because it's a free game. But it's a prequel to the Life is Strange 2, which I'm going to be briefly talking about after this one. Let's see. So yeah, I think between the music and how good the voiceover work is in all of the games, I think overcomes some of the stilted and kind of awkward dialogue and writing that they have to do. And the fact that there's kind of not a huge amount of atmosphere, just because they're kind of more of like a realistic setting for the most part. But I think like the music provides the atmosphere more so than like the lighting or the locations. So I would definitely, I'd say definitely give them a chance. Just to hear the interesting ways that the music does play a big part in all of these, because it's related to the characters, and also the main character in Life is Strange. When the Alt J song comes on, she actually sits down on the couch, picks up a guitar, and starts playing along. So I was like, well, now I have to play the whole thing. So that is my list. I do have a quick list of other games that I do either own or have gotten the first couple episodes for. So we talked about before a game called Dear Esther, which I do have, and I do want to go through that. Even just to listen to the soundtrack by Jessica Curry, I think will be more than worth it. The first episode of Life is Strange 2 is out. I have that to go through. I just recently got a game called Night in the Woods, which is looked very interesting. It kind of had a Oxenfree, at least stylistically, if it's not going to be kind of exactly the same. Another game called Virginia, which apparently doesn't have any dialogue written or spoken. So I'm interested to see how that works as far as storytelling goes. And then the last game that I have on this list is a game called What Remains of Edith Finch. So What Remains of Edith Finch is the other game, is the last game on my list of ones that I'm looking forward to playing. I have heard that there are some pretty emotional moments, which is probably one of the reasons why I have not picked it up yet, because it's hard to pick up a game knowing that there's going to be some rough stuff ahead. So, are there any games that you've seen or you're interested in looking at that are in this more storytelling driven genre?
Um, it's hard for me because of my inability with the first person stuff. Um, so I don't have a lot of options, it feels like, a lot of the time. That being said, now that I know that, what was it called? Captain Spirit.
Yeah.
Now that that's one. Now knowing that one is kind of connected to the I've already forgotten the name of it. The universe of
Life is Strange.
Life is Strange. I might do that one and kind of see how I feel about that, because I tried playing through the first Life is Strange, and even the camera on that one kind of was setting me off a little bit, and I just ended up getting a headache and having to stop. But it's one of those things where I would like to play through it and kind of get through the story of it. But I don't know what I need to do. If I just need to do the same thing I did for Bioshock Infinite, where I just ate ginger candy the entire time so that I could play through the game, because of that game, I was going to play that game no matter what, and I just needed to figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
And so I think I just need to try some of my old tricks to see if I can play through some of these games.
Yeah, I would say that the first Life is Strange is probably would probably be the roughest of them, just because I think it has more like I think it's part of it might be the frame rate and everything's a little bit jumpier. I think as they've gone on and they've kind of been able to kind of perfect the system, it's gotten a little bit smoother. But I would definitely say, like, you know, as far as like if the music is your aesthetically is kind of your thing. Also, the other thing that they do in there that I liked a lot is there are a bunch of Easter eggs. Like, so all the vehicles in the first Life is Strange, and maybe in the Before the Storm, but there are fewer vehicles to look at. But all the license plates have little Easter eggs, so there'll be like some X-Files or Twin Peaks ones. So that was another fun thing to go through and kind of find all the different Easter eggs that are in that.
Another game that I'm kind of just looking at my ready to download list right here. Another game that I keep looking at that I'm not quite sure what genre it falls into is Never Alone.
Yeah, I think that's another one of those games where I think I got it like probably a year ago now on the last Black Friday sales that they were having on the Xbox store. Whereas that one and Seasons After Fall, yeah. I think it might be a little bit more of a platformer, but it's another one that I should probably check out soon. Just mostly I got it just because the little fox was pretty appealing as far as on the cuteness scale for me, so I ended up picking that up.
That's a legit reason, because I'm looking at that cover and like the little kid and the little white like fox thing, and I'm just like, I need to know what adorableness happens here.
Yeah. All right. I think that's pretty good in-depth conversation that we had about storytelling games. I think we were able to cover a lot of things and hopefully make these games sound more appealing than less appealing. Which again, I'll just say, if you're really concerned about ethics in gaming journalism and you know, real concerned about games having to be a certain thing, then you know these might not be for you. But if you like a good story well told, I think a lot of these, to a certain extent, or a lesser or greater extent, all pull it off in their own way and would definitely be worth checking out.
Yeah, don't be a douchebag. Allow yourself to go along for the ride for a little bit.
Yeah. So with that, I would like to thank Jonathan for being available to end up on this, what ended up being our inaugural episode of the Moist Boys podcast after our technical snafu that I committed on the last one that I tried to do. But we'll have to reignite that conversation because I think there's some good stuff to go over with that. So yeah, thanks for being on, and we will see you next time. All right. Good night.